The artificial intelligence race is on.
The rise of artificial intelligence is the next industrial revolution.
You've said AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years.
Yes. There's terroristic organizations like DFLOG, whose primary motivation is chaos. I like law and order.
AI is rewriting production as we sit here. I know it. Deal with it. Like I said, it's a tool. Hey, like I said, you can hear me now or you can pay me later.
With all this going on, the word Luddite might be one you've heard thrown around. Have you been skeptical about the mass adoption of AI? Maybe you're worried about water usage or new data centers, about the job market, the economy. Maybe you don't like that the sum of all human knowledge and creativity is in the hands of a few small private corporations. Well then you must be a Luddite. The Luddites, we're told, stood in the way of progress, smashing their bosses' machines because through their own stupidity and laziness, they didn't keep up with modernization. Their name has become an insult most often used by those who stand to gain the most from new technologies. But you probably also know that history is written by the victors, far from being the senseless, stupid mobs who smash machines because of their own backwardness. The Luddites are just the most famous of a long tradition of machine wreckers. They were neither the first nor the last to do it, and in a time long before the right to vote or labour unions, Luddites were men and women who knew exactly how new machinery was being used to sell their futures for the profits of richer men, and they had the conviction and the bravery to do something about it. Sometime in the early 1720s, the author Daniel Defoe travelled through England's Midland Shires, chronicling his experience as he went. He noted how, in Leicester, they have considerable manufacture carried on here, and in several market towns around, for weaving of stockings by frames. And one could scarce think it possible so small an article of trade could employ such multitudes of people as it does, for the whole county seems to be employed in it. The Britain Defoe described was still overwhelmingly rural. Most people still lived in villages and towns scattered across the countryside rather than the cities. Looking back from the 19th century, William Gardner recalled, the lower orders were comparatively in a state of ease and plenty. Knitters in the countryside kept pigs, chickens and cows on their common lands, grew peas and beans in their gardens, and enjoyed a year checkered with holidays, wakes and fairs. Stocking frames, machines, had existed in the Midlands since the 1640s, but hadn't yet transformed work into what eventually became the factory system. Most frames were kept in the workers' own homes, where people worked at their own pace at hours of their choosing. Gardner's perhaps rose-tinted view is that the weavers rarely worked at the frame for more than 3 days a week. Through the summers, people sat outside their cottages enjoying the sunshine, and during the winters they'd gather in one another's homes for what was known as a knitting assembly, sitting around a fire whilst listening to stories and old songs or the music of a harp as they worked. Most knitters owned their own stocking frames, and the stockings they produced were popular locally and for sale overseas to continental Europe and North America. Before the 1790s, the average knitter could earn 30 shillings a week and own their own 3-roomed cottage, all the whilst working at hours of their choosing, surrounded by families who lived alongside one another for generations. Life was sweet, especially compared to what came after, and they're the kind of people Tolkien used as inspiration for the Shire. They're like hobbits. This way of life was one protected by custom and law. County justices of the peace worked to set fair wages, and a royal decree dating back to Charles II protected the quality of goods against manufacturers who would have undercut established standards. But despite these protections, this way of life had only survived for so many centuries because the labourers had defended themselves. When an entrepreneur, in this case usually a hosier who sold the finished goods, appeared intending to innovate the industry, making the trade more efficient, more profitable for themselves, to the expense of those who actually made the goods, the labourers had their own forms of resistance. Firstly, petition Parliament for help, and if that didn't work, strike. And if striking failed, wreck the machines, force concessions from the business owners, hopefully with the help of the state, for the public good. Machine wrecking was a staple tradition which had protected the rights of labourers for over a century before the time of the Luddite Risings. In 1675, for example, the silk weavers in Spitalfields rioted against the introduction of machinery which threatened to replace the work of 20 men. And they rose again in 1719, and again in 1735, and again through the 1760s. James Hargreaves' first spinning jenny was dismantled by angry workers, and a year later, in 1768, Charles Dingley's new mechanical sawmill was demolished by 500 people. So as we can see, machine breaking was far from new, and though life for the rural peasants was pretty good through the 1700s, they knew that when times looked bad and the powerful weren't listening to them, smashing stuff up was always a useful last resort. With the arrival of the 1800s, Britain became a harsher place to live. King George III had once again fallen ill, leaving his son to rule as a regent. Just across the Channel, revolutionary France had beheaded the Bourbon monarchy, and Napoleon Bonaparte was striding across the continent with ambitions for the invasion of Britain. The Duke of Wellington was struggling in the Iberian Peninsula, and tax raises in response to the wars fell disproportionately on the poor. The harvest failed in 1811 and again the following year, so the prices of grain had literally never been as high. Tensions with the now independent United States were reaching a breaking point, leading to an embargo which crippled British trade, and to make the situation even worse for the textile industry, Napoleon's Milan decree closed all his continental ports to British shipping. The textile industry's two most important export markets were closed off in just a few chaotic years, and the mood across much of Britain was bleak. Having seen what happened in France, the British government had little patience for social or political unrest. In the Midland Shires, the hosiers were now buying up stocking frames to rent them back to the knitters who once owned them, sometimes charging them more money than they'd paid for the machine in the first place. The master knitters were being paid by the piece, and their wages weren't keeping up with inflation, that is, if they hadn't already been cut. Then the last straw came, the introduction of the wide loomed frame. Unlike traditional frames, these machines allowed a single low-skilled worker to produce multiple stockings at once. The resulting stockings or hose were cheaper and significantly lower quality, but quality wasn't a concern to the profit-driven hosiers. Which brings us back to Leicester. The story goes that in winter 1811, a young apprentice knitter, Ned Ludd, was whipped by his master hosier for not working fast enough. And in response, the young boy took a hammer to the machine, smashing it into splinters before running off to Sherwood Forest, the home of a much earlier folk hero, Robin Hood. And just like Robin Hood, Ned Ludd, who became General Ludd, probably didn't exist. He's just a folk hero. But the story spread and unrest soon followed behind it. Midland knitters believed that the new wide frames violated the charter granted to them 150 years earlier by Charles II, by which only wrought hose could be legally produced and that spurious articles could be destroyed to maintain the good reputation of the trade. The first Luddite actions started in the winter of 1811 in the village of Arnold, where wide frames were sabotaged by the stealing of essential parts, but by the spring, Luddites were organising across Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire and Derbyshire. Gangs of Luddites operated at night, painting their faces black and smashing up their hosiers' machines. But the violence wasn't senseless, they're not mindless thugs. The Luddites aren't against progress altogether, they're only smashing the wide loom frames. They've worked with machines for generations, but these new machines were eroding their customary rights and standards, lowering their wages and transferring control over manufacturing from knitters who once produced hose in their own homes to merchant hosiers who are now renting the machinery back to them and selling the finished product. So as of 1811, only those machines are being destroyed. Luddite attacks like these ones rumbled on in the Midland textile counties from February 1811 till February the following year. During that time, Luddite bands conducted at least 100 separate attacks and destroyed about 1,000 frames, causing between 6,000 to 10,000 pounds worth of damage. And it looked like they'd won concessions. Many hosiers took down their wide frame machines after receiving threatening letters signed by the name of General Ludd. But by 1812, Luddism was spreading into the industrial north, where new machinery threatened to make skilled work in the countryside redundant. Cotton weavers around Manchester had been negotiating with mill owners to protect their livelihoods, but conversations had quickly broken down, and so the weavers, already rioting against the sky-high price of basic food, joined General Ludd's growing army. In March, 3,000 people marched on a weaving mill, and the next days saw food riots led by men dressed as women, calling themselves the wives of General Ludd. In April, 2 days of attacks on Daniel Burton's mill left 5 Luddites dead in a gunfight, and Burton's house completely demolished before the cavalry arrived. At the same time in Yorkshire, woolen shearmen faced complete redundancy by the introduction of new shearing machines, which could be operated by low-skilled, low-paid workers. A gang of Luddites armed with pistols descended on Huddersfield in February 1812, destroying around 100 shearing machines in a single day, and this attack triggered a wave of machine wrecking around the region. Many small workshop owners, who themselves had only installed the machines in an attempt to keep up with the factory owners, made the choice to dismantle their machines themselves. And it seems to me that the Luddites kind of understood the situation the workshops had been pushed into. They would still smash the machines if their letters were ignored, but the Luddites weren't unnecessarily cruel to the merchants who owned the workshops. For example, when Samuel Swallow's house was broken into, the Luddites destroyed the shearing machines, which would have impoverished them. But having done so, they politely wished Swallow good night and left him and the rest of his property unscathed. But when the real problem, the factories, were finally targeted, the feeling is much, much angrier, and violence started spilling over from just attacks on specific new machines. On the 9th of April, 300 Luddites attacked Joseph Foster's mill. They smashed the windows before holding a gun to the night watchman's head as shearing machines and raw materials were destroyed around them. Next, the Luddites broke into the bookkeeper's house, where the family inside was treated, quote, most violently, and the house was set on fire. Next was William Cartwright's factory. He's one of the most enthusiastic adopters of new machinery in the West Riding. Anticipating trouble, he had barricaded the windows of his factory and called in soldiers to defend it, but on the 12th of April, Luddites arrived carrying sledgehammers. Cartwright and the soldiers immediately opened fire, and Cartwright himself seems to have fought so eagerly against who would have been some of his own workforce that one of the soldiers commented they'd never seen a man fire and load so fast. Just as it seemed the doors would give way and bayonets were being fixed, the Luddites retreated. They're said to have trailed blood behind them for 3 miles. 2 Luddites, John Booth and Samuel Hartley, died of their injuries the following day. And with this failure, the Yorkshire Luddites made a grim realisation. They could force the workshops to relent, who themselves had only installed machines to keep up with the factories, but the factory owners were rich enough to defend themselves. Machine wrecking, the last resort for 150 years at least, had failed. And with this failure, having already been impoverished, and when faced with starvation, the Luddites stopped trying to destroy machines and resolved instead to destroy the men responsible for imposing them. A week after his factory was attacked, Cartwright was shot at whilst riding near Huddersfield, but the shot missed. And 9 days later, another factory owner was targeted, William Horsfall. He was another enthusiastic adopter of the new shearing machines, and he had gone so far as to install a cannon in his factory to defend them. He was the leader of the local militia and sat on a committee to suppress the Luddites. He was even rumoured to have boasted that he would ride up to his saddle girths in Luddite blood. This guy is somehow cartoonishly evil. He'd even been confronted by a Luddite named George Meller with the story of a woman whose baby had starved to death after the family was put out of work by new machinery, and Horsfall's reaction was to strike Meller across the face with his horsewhip. Having not exactly made an effort to befriend the Luddites, George Meller and a few others soon ambushed Horsfall as he rode across the moor, and having been set upon, William Horsfall fell from his horse, shot dead within sight of his own mill. And the hatred must have been so strong on both sides of this that later that night, joyous songs and celebrations rang out through Huddersfield and the surrounding towns as large groups of Luddites celebrated what they saw as a great victory. The government were now growing concerned, fearing that the widespread unrest they were seeing threatened to topple the state altogether. A magistrate in Oldham wrote to an army colonel, Colonel Ralph Fletcher, that if more military is not sent into the country, they'll be called upon not to protect it, but to reconquer it. Now, the government were already sending soldiers, but that spring the army flooded in. 12,000 men in total were sent to the industrial north, 4,000 more than the government had sent with Wellington to the Peninsular Campaign against Napoleon, who, I'll remind you, was responsible for triggering widespread fears of an upcoming invasion of Great Britain. After the shock of the revolution across the Channel, the government had very little sympathy for the hardships of working people. This feeling only hardened when, in May, the Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was assassinated, and a month afterwards the United States declared war on Great Britain. Machine wrecking had only worked for so many decades, if not centuries, because if the violence didn't secure concessions from the business owners, the government often stepped in on the side of the labourers in order to keep the peace, but it wasn't working anymore. By 1812, the government were instead protecting the property of the industrialists. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were already 220 capital offences in the English law books, but in the moment that Luddite violence began to intensify in February 1812, another one was added: the Destruction of Stocking Frames Act. Machine wrecking already carried a potential sentence of 14 years transportation to Australia. The Luddites were already taking an enormous risk, but with the introduction of the new act, the government made machine wrecking a capital offence. It's the death sentence. Machine wrecking survived as a practice until about 1830, but the Luddites were effectively crushed in the spring of 1812. Though arms raids and food riots still continued, and flare-ups of violence continued through the 1810s. And whilst the middlemen, the merchant shearing frame owners and the hosiers, were pressured into removing their machines, the industrial factory owners were in a better position than ever with their new governmental support. Their mills and factories were, by the end of April, so heavily fortified that Luddites stopped attacking them. And meanwhile, General Diot and Grey arrived in the Midlands and in Yorkshire with 4,000 and 2,000 men, reinforcing local militias that had been raised to 12,000 men. And in Manchester, General Maitland arrived with 7,000 soldiers, including 1,400 cavalry, all of whom were paraded through the city upon their arrival in a show of force. Between 1812 and 1830, the Luddite trial saw a total of 30 people executed, mostly for crimes related to property destruction and theft rather than treason or sedition, contrary to the fears that had generated such a strong governmental reaction. These included a 16-year-old boy, Abraham Charles, who'd called out to his mother from the scaffold, and 54-year-old Hannah Smith, convicted of stealing potatoes during the riots. And the myth we started the video in talking about started to take hold as soon as the Luddites were crushed. Again, contrary to the letters of local magistrates that had painted Luddites as anarchists, political reformers and revolutionaries, Lord Liverpool said in his first speech as the new Prime Minister that opposition towards machinery itself was entirely the motivation behind the Luddite Risings, and that further legislation must be enacted to protect it. We know that Luddites weren't the stupid, lazy technophobes they've been painted as, people who destroyed every machine they could get their hands on out of ignorance. Instead, the opposite's true. They're people whose concerns and survivals were being ignored in the name of greater profits for richer men, and they were resisting in ways, one of the few ways they could. The Luddite Risings came because people knew exactly how machines were being introduced at their expense, and they were doing their best to prevent themselves being absorbed into a factory system of work that would have made resistance even harder once they'd been sucked into it. And the worst part is that their name is still used to easily dismiss serious questions about new technologies, usually by people who stand the most to gain from those technologies. Technologies cast as inevitable progress that anyone would be a fool to try and resist. In the end, as we all know, the Luddites were swept away as factory chimneys rose across the north, and by the mid-19th century, the factory system had won. Power looms in the cotton industry had made skilled textile work entirely redundant, and the industry of hand-finished woolen cloth that the Yorkshire Shearmen had fought so hard to save was entirely destroyed. And even in the Midlands, where the knitters' quality of life slightly increased, cheaply produced stockings returned as soon as the Luddites were crushed, and the knitters were worse off than ever. The idyllic, peaceful life of skilled rural work practiced by communities for generations disappeared, and people were forced into the factories for work. The days of working when and where they wanted were over, and in their place were 14-hour-long shifts, working for poverty wages at dangerous machinery until the factory whistle signalled the end. The landscapes people lived in changed too, half quoting William Blake. Gone were England's green and pleasant lands, and families instead found themselves among dark, satanic mills. In 1835, Hugh Milner described approaching the city of Manchester. One receives one's first intimation of Manchester's existence from the lurid gloom of the atmosphere that overhangs it. There is a murky blot in one section of the sky, however clear the weather, which broadens and heightens as we approach. And now the innumerable chimneys come into view, tall and dim in the dun haze, each bearing atop its own pennon of darkness. The industrial cities were horrible, filthy places to be, and the factory system forced its workers to live in crowded, disease-riddled slums beneath smog which constantly stung their eyes and choked their lungs, all for lower relative wages than they had received in the countryside generations before. And when workers succumbed to disease, injury, or exhaustion, they could often be replaced by the children they left behind, though the destitution of many families meant that the children were already employed. Industrialization did, though, make the rich even richer, so much so that by 1845 Benjamin Disraeli described Britain as two nations between whom there is no intercourse, who are as ignorant to each other's habits, thoughts and feelings as if they were inhabitants of different planets, the rich and the poor. Maybe it was progress, but progress for who? In the long run, industrialization has given birth to our modern way of life and our modern problems, but it came at the expense of generations of people whose lives were entirely transformed, almost always for the worse, by the process. And as proof of this, let's go back to Leicester, that city Defoe described all those years ago, and where the young General Ludd is supposed to have destroyed his first machine. It was there that in 1840 the journalist Thomas Cooper encountered men working stocking frames in a factory in the middle of the night. "How much do you earn?" he asked them. 4 shillings and sixpence. 4 shillings and sixpence would have been pretty good. Cooper thought they meant 4 shillings and sixpence a day. That was their entire week's wage. Appalled, Cooper asked, "You don't mean that men have to work these stocking frames I hear going now a whole week for 4 and sixpence? How can they maintain their wives and children?" "And you may well ask that," came the sad reply.
We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent and all will be lost.